Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about science. In this video, we're going to look at what the press and scientists have to say about protesters. The Washington Post says that lockdown protesters don't care about lives. These people were protesting the fact that they weren't allowed to work and feed their families. But the Washington Post said that this small group of well-behaved people was going to cause a massive viral epidemic. And USA Today said that people who wanted to work and get the economy back going risked your health and were going to slow the reopening of the U.S. economy. Business Insider said that people who wanted to work were mind-bogglingly selfish. This small group of peaceful anti-lockdown protesters in Canada was called reckless. Dr. Burke said that the protesters in the Michigan Capitol were devastatingly worrisome. But for some reason, Dr. Burke didn't say anything about being worried about the Michigan governor who was sending sick people into nursing homes. The only person in the state capitol who was killing people was the governor herself. Jimmy Kimmel said that lockdown protesters were suicidal. The Guardian said that lockdown protesters may have spread the virus widely. Journalists said that lockdown protesters have a moral duty to forego medical care in favor of those who followed the rules. Vox said that people who wanted to work and feed their children were racists. Their argument was that black people had suffered COVID deaths at a higher rate than white people. Thus, white people who wanted to work were risking the lives of black people. But all of a sudden, a few days ago, everything changed. A government employee in the most left-wing city and most left-wing state in the country killed a black man. The two men worked together for 17 years, and there's never been any motive established for the killing, but the press immediately determined that this was due to white racism and white supremacy. And all of a sudden, mass protests were a good thing, not a bad thing. Apparently, viruses know to stay away from social justice protests. Protesters no longer menace the public with the virus, but 10-year-old children running a street corner carnival apparently did. The New York Police Department sent 3 vehicles to disrupt a street corner carnival run by 10-year-old Jewish children. They said that these 10-year-old children threatened the public with coronavirus, even though the World Health Organization says there's not one single documented case of a child passing the disease to an adult. And these same medical professionals on Twitter who demanded the lockdowns and demanded the end to the anti-lockdown protests suddenly changed their view. This online petition was signed by many bigwigs in the Twitter medical community. Now they said that mass protests were a good thing because they were going to end white supremacy. I'm 63 years old and I've lived in many parts of the country, and I've never met a white supremacist. I'm sure there's some white supremacists out there somewhere, but it's unlikely that very many of them are in positions of power. But during my life, I have met tens of thousands of delusional leftists. There's not one shred of evidence to support the idea that this killing had anything to do with white supremacy. The problem with our Democrat-run inner cities is not white supremacists. It's incompetent policies from Democratic politicians and thinkers. 50 years of failed progressive thinking and policy has done huge amounts of damage to our inner cities. Democratic policies have been based around the idea of keeping blacks dependent on Democratic politicians. A more appropriate motto for Democratic politicians than Black Lives Matter would be Black Votes Matter. These protests have destroyed the lives and businesses of countless black people, yet these leftists continue to support them. I'm not surprised a bit that people like Rachel, who promoted the lockdowns and attacked anti-lockdown protesters, are also flaming leftists. But what's interesting about their stance is that it's now clear that these health professionals do not believe these large gatherings of people are a significant risk to public safety. If they did believe it, they would not be supporting these mass protests and riots. Their anti-lockdown protester stance was based on politics, not public health. Overnight, they changed their stance to say, "We support protests as vital to the national public health." Protests which support their political bias are a good thing and vital to the national health, but protests against their political position are a threat to public safety. Their position is all about politics, not public health. But they are correct about one thing. Other than the violence of the protests themselves, the protests are not a huge threat to public health. This article appeared in the Wall Street Journal yesterday. It said, "Here's the good news. If you're an average American living outside New York City, the epidemic was a period with barely noticeable increased risk. Your chance of being an extra fatality was about 1 in 5,000, somewhat higher than your chance of dying in an auto accident in a year. And if you're under 50 with no serious health conditions, your risk was in the ballpark of 1 in 50,000, similar to your risk of dying in a fire. So why was New York City different? A more credible explanation is the incompetence of our state and local governments. Mayor Bill de Blasio, Governor Andrew Cuomo. The New York State Department of Health ordered the transfer of some 4,300 COVID-19 patients from hospitals to nursing homes. This exposed the oldest, frailest, and most vulnerable to the virus. There was never a huge threat to the general public. The threat was to nursing homes, and that was coming from government officials. State and local government officials also created the lockdowns, which put 40 million people out of work so far. These Twitter health professionals say that it's vital to the national public health to have these demonstrations and riots. But it's not okay to go to work, go to church, attend sporting events, or attend concerts. These professionals say that it's safe to riot, but it's definitely not safe to go to school. These health professionals seem to think that looting and burning cities is okay, but listening to country music and watching rodeos is much too dangerous. And look who else has jumped on board in support of the rioters. Whoever writes Greta Thunberg's tweets no longer seems to be too worried about climate. Now they have rioters to support instead. And why would they worry about climate? The lockdowns achieved all of the goals of the Green New Deal already. They've succeeded in largely destroying the airline industry and putting tens of millions of people out of work. CO2 emissions are way down. Climate alarmists have gotten exactly what they wanted. Another prominent climate scientist, Jessica Turney, says it's about racism and white supremacy. These people seem to have no qualms lying about climate or any other topic which suits their political agenda. And the world's #1 climate fraudster, Michael Mann, is still stuck on the Russia collusion big lie. This never had anything to do with Russia collusion, the Ukraine, climate, a virus, or racial justice. This has always been about trying to reverse the results of the last election and interfere with the next election. It's about unscrupulous people trying to seize power away from the public. This is exactly what President Eisenhower warned about in his farewell address in 1961.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. Akin to and largely responsible for the sweeping changes in our industrial military posture has been the technological revolution during recent decades. In this revolution, research has become central. It also becomes more formalized, complex, and costly. A steadily increasing share is conducted for, by, or at the direction of the federal government. Today, the solitary inventor, tinkering in his shop, has been overshadowed by task forces of scientists in laboratories and testing fields. In the same fashion, the free university, historically the fountainhead of free ideas and scientific discovery, has experienced a revolution in the conduct of research. Partly because of the huge costs involved, a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. For every old blackboard, there are now hundreds of new electronic computers. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological, elite.
People like Michael Mann and Jessica Turney are exactly who President Eisenhower was warning us about. But we don't have to listen to unscrupulous academics, and we don't have to send sick people to nursing homes like they did in Italy, New York, and Michigan. One country which ignored the doomsayers about COVID-19 was Belarus, and they did much better than the United States or most of the countries in Europe. Belarus protected their old people, and they protected their young people by allowing them to live life. They never shut down their civilization, and they never shut down their professional sports. People in Belarus go to football matches for their entertainment. They don't go out on the street and burn down and loot businesses. Our civilization is threatened by leftists who won't allow people to burn cities down, but want to ban 10-year-olds from holding a street corner carnival. In one way, Greta Thunberg is right. It is devastating to see the development taking place in the USA. 40 million unemployed, and cities being burned down by crazed leftists. People who want our civilization to survive have to stop putting up with this insanity. Our future, and the future of our children and grandchildren, has never been at more risk. President Trump is trying to put Americans back to work, but the press and other leftists are trying to burn America down. These leftists don't care about all the poverty, hunger, and homelessness which is looming on the horizon for millions of children. They only care about one thing, and that's power and control of other people. 3 months ago, we had a booming economy, historically low unemployment, and President Trump was cruising to victory. But leftists couldn't allow this to happen, so over the past 3 months, we've seen their scorched earth policy. What's going on in the United States right now is very ugly, and it's not easy to look at. It would be very easy to just turn away and pretend that we don't see what's going on. But Ayn Rand said, the hardest thing to explain is the glaringly evident which everybody has decided not to see. Toto keeps his eyes wide open and sees very clearly what's going on. Visit him on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.